Right, just before we crack on with this episode, just a quick word about our sponsor, KS Civils and Groundworks Limited, based in Leeds. They have over 296 years of combined experience in civil engineering and groundworks. Led by Director Carl Smith, their team is known for honesty, reliability and commitment to the highest safety and quality standards. They're proudly ISO accredited and fully CHAS Elite accredited. No matter the size of your project, KS Civils and Groundworks delivers professional, trustworthy service you can rely on. To learn more, visit kscivilsandgroundworks.co.uk. Now let's dive back into this episode.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today I've got a returning visitor, Field Marshal, the Lord David Richards. Congratulations on the promotion.
Well, that's very kind. I thought those things had finished, but the King sent me a lovely letter, and I'm not going to say no to His Majesty. And obviously it's a great, great honour, and I'm very chuffed. So, but thank you very much, Frankie. I hope it means a lot to our old regiment. Well, I know it does, but also to the Royal Regiment as a whole. And indeed, I've had lots of congratulations from people around the armed forces. So, no, thank you very much. Very chuffed. Undeserved, but I'm not going to say no.
I mean, it's quite unusual in this day and age, isn't it, really?
Well, yes, the serving CDS, after the generation like Montgomery and so on retired, from then on, the only five-star officer who was serving was the Chief of Defence Staff. On retirement, the heads of the services got five-star honorary rank. And then around 97, 98, they decided that the CDS should not be a five-star while serving. So they did away with it. That was Charles Guthrie, later Lord Guthrie. And in 2012, the Queen made him a Field Marshal along with the then Prince of Wales, now the King. And then a couple of years later, three other ex-CDSs were made five stars. One Navy, one Army, one Air Force. I was the next, and it had all gone quiet. So many years later, the great and the good had decided that they should resurrect the rank for retired CDSs. I'm not certain why. It's a sort of thank you, but it's also to remind people, I suppose, of the sort of responsibilities and duties of the head of the armed forces. And, at a time when things are pretty tough in the defence world, it's a useful reminder that, we've got people in these ranks who are trying to do things to help. So, yeah, very, very lucky. But, I'm duly humbled, I can tell you.
It's well deserved, though. Well deserved.
Well, you're very kind.
In this edition of the podcast, I'd like to expand a little bit more on some of the things that we spoke about on the first one. And if anybody hasn't seen that one, they want to go back, it's episode 74, I believe it is. And I believe it is, I should know. And we go in that episode, we go through your early life into the army and the progression through that. You were involved in some very key times, I'd say conflicts almost in your time from being brigadier upwards. The main one I want to talk about at the moment is Sierra Leone. Your involvement in that. When I say you made it, really, it could have gone very wrong, but you decided to, as you said, you went beyond the mandate. Compared to what other people might have done. Can you just explain what you mean when you say you went beyond the mandate on that?
Well, we could spend the next hour talking about Sierra Leone. Funny enough, I had a chap here earlier in the week who's determined to write another book about it. And as many of the Third RHA viewers know, there's a joke about who's going to play me in the movie. The hot money is on Danny DeVito. Well, I laugh, of course, at that. I thought Daniel Craig might want to. But anyway, there is talk of a movie, and it is still bubbling along, but it's taken years and years. getting nowhere fast, I think. It was only a 6-week operation, but there were lots of nuances to it. But I give you the gist of it. I'd been out to Sierra Leone 3 times before May 2000, when the operation we're discussing now, Operation Palliser, took place. So I knew Sierra Leone quite well. I'd seen some awful things the year before when the RUF rebels had ransacked Freetown. And I remember particularly going to the hospital, which was in a hell of a state. I mean, we complain about the NHS compared with Sierra Leone Freetown Hospital. We've got nothing to worry about. And I remember in particular a family coming up, about 2 families, and a little girl coming up to me wanting to shake my hand because they thought I had sort of single-handedly pushed the rebels back. Actually, it was the Nigerians and the Sierra Leone army that pushed them back, and I was advising them. And the little girl tried to hold my hand and then looked down at her hand to realize she didn't have one because the RUF had chopped it off. And that was their signature atrocity, partly to intimidate the population, but also downstream, they couldn't vote, could they, if they haven't got a hand, because most couldn't write, so they used thumbprints, or even to write you need a hand. So that left a hell of a mark on me, and the other things I saw at that time, and it really was an issue of a democratically elected government under a man called President Kaba, being initially undermined and then brutally attacked by some drug-crazed, diamond-fueled rebels called the Revolutionary United Front under a chap called Foday Sankoh. I went out again actually in March. 2000. Things had deteriorated, but I did what I could to help. But then I was ordered back for other things. But in May, early May, I was on an exercise, fun enough, with the special forces, and things had clearly were deteriorating. And I said to the CEO of 22 SAS, we were chatting, looks like we might be in some business again in Sierra Leone. It was about on a Wednesday. And sure enough, on the Friday, we flew out to Sierra Leone. I landed on the 5th of May. And I had already decided that actually we had to put a stop to the RUF. But, and this is a point you're getting at, my orders simply told me to evacuate the British and other entitled persons, EPs, from the country and leave. Well, having seen what I'd seen the year before and knowing the RUF, because I'd got to understand them, and the other major players, I decided that we could do a lot more than just evacuate and leave, leaving the country to an awful fate, which I'd seen the year before and was determined not to risk again. And of course, if you think about it, we'd not long before had the atrocity, the genocide in Rwanda, through muddled military confusion, really, and lack of resolve, arguably, and also in Srebrenica in Bosnia. So, our record wasn't very good in these circumstances. Anyway, I decided that we could do better, but I had no orders to do it. So I used tactics that you would see as rather similar to what you need to do an evacuation. And I persuaded people back in London that I was simply being rather brave in the use of my troops in order to protect the evacuation. In fact, I was using them to get to grips with the RUF and start to push them back. And I had to conceal that effectively from London because there were people there who were saying, what are you doing? Do the evacuation and get your ass back to London, sort of thing, or northward where I was based. And I said, don't worry, it's just taking a bit longer. I lied through my teeth, to be frank. But the great thing was my whole team, I had a wonderful team of tri-service people. And in particular, my chief of staff was a Colonel Neil Salisbury, and I had an MA called Mark Mangum. And the three of us conspired to do the right thing. But also Paul Gibson, who was commanding the parachute battalion, and others. Later, 4-2 Commando arrived under Andy Salmon. But lots of other people. We were all in on it. And they didn't betray me, if you like, which they could have done, I suppose, back to London. And they didn't initially quite know what I was up to be fair, but they certainly guessed and very soon understood. So we stopped the rebels. We pushed them back. I had to create a strike force out of Sierra Leoneans and people called Camajor militia, and also the West Side Boys, all of whom, well, the West Side Boys had been the enemy until a short time before, but I went and persuaded their boss that he should work with us. And then the UN got their act together. I was going to say got off their asses because they weren't doing very much. Got their act together. And after about 6 weeks, having captured Fodo Sanko and really given the RUF a bloody nose or two, we pushed them way back from Freetown and handed the operation over to the United Nations. I did have to go back in the autumn and we actually forced the RUF into a proper ceasefire then. And it was a very satisfying operation, but I was very lucky. But the establishment, if you like, recognized that I had done the right thing, even though they were a bit bemused when they realized the extent of what we'd done. And they gave me a DSO for it. So I always say, no, okay, I deceived them, but I'm very grateful to them because in the end, good sense and judgment all round, including from Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, who claimed some credit for this, and in some respects deservedly so, because although I had no comms with him, which was my problem, I had to use the media to get to that level, particularly a man called Alan Little of the BBC, but others too. But I sensed that Tony Blair would have been supportive. It gave me, to some degree, the freedom to do what we did.
Well, I read a book recently by Steve Heaney from the Pathfinders.
Oh, yeah.
And the forward in there from yourself was quite interesting. I mean, it was very rapid, all the action that happened. And I mean, in reading his book, he expressed quite I wouldn't say disdain from the lack of equipment, let's say, but they made do with what they had, and they did very well. It's a really interesting book. Obviously, you know of it. Was that part of the decisive battle that actually turned the tide with the RUF?
Yes, Steve's a great man. First soldier recipient of the Military Cross, which I was delighted to help write the citation for. Basically, I needed a battle with the RUF, and we were having lots of skirmishes, and we were pushing them back, but I wanted to give them a really bloody nose in order to convince them they were going to lose and the Brits meant business. So I took a bit of a risk with Colonel Paul Gibson's entire cooperation. He put the Pathfinder platoon plus a few more odds and sods into an exposed position to the north east of the airfield, which was vital ground. It was vital ground for us because that's how at that stage, we were only way to bring in our logistics. Not long after we started this, the 42 Commando, an aircraft carrier, HMS Asia, we had a plenty of what we needed. But until that time, as you hint, we were all flying, working on very light scales. So I ordered them into Lungi Lol in an exposed position, and the RUF took the bait, attacked them there, thinking that they would force them out of the way, and that's the Pathfinders, and then they'd be on the airfield, and we would have. It was sensible tactics on their part. But Steve Heaney and the Pathfinder platoon fought heroically and beat them back, inflicted a lot of casualties on them. And that was the bloody nose I needed, because after that, they thought they weren't going to take us on. So it was a vital part, but it was a quite risky part of the operation, because for a while, they were very pressed by the RUF. But with Steve and others doing things we all always admire, and people rise to the challenge, don't they? We were successful. But if it had gone wrong, I would have I mean, people say you're gonna be cut off at the knees, Richards, if this stuff doesn't work. But thank God for Steve and the platoon.
I mean, it's a fascinating book. It really, really is, and I'm hoping to get him on the podcast quite soon. It just, as I was reading it, I just kept thinking of like Yul Brynner and the Magnificent Seven. It's an astonishing story. It really is.
It's well worth it, and you must try and get him on. You know, I spent the night. Well, I slept, I'm sure, but first thing the next morning when they pushed them back, I got in a helicopter, went to visit them. I've never been so grateful to a bunch of blokes. And he writes about that in the book, you know. But anyway, yeah, you try and get him on. He's a great chap.
So, talking about Sierra Leone, what did it teach you about decisive action and this?
Yeah,
your responsibilities at stake and stuff like that.
Well, responsibilities I'd sort of got hold of. I knew I was always look if it went wrong, I wasn't going to blame or ensure that no one else got the blame except me. So you know that's the way it is. That's how we're all brought up, and what you would expect of your commanders. The trick to success in military operations is to know your enemy. Sun Tzu, the Chinese soldier philosopher, says that. I was in a fortunate position. I felt I knew the RUF rebels and their weaknesses, and I had a good feel for the strengths and weaknesses of my unholy alliance, I called it, which was the Sierra Leones I told you about. I gathered together, the West Side Boys and so on. But I needed them because I didn't have enough combat power in the British force alone. And don't forget, I still had no orders to use them in the way I needed. So I needed to create a strike force. But the trick, I think, at the low tactical level, and indeed at any level of war, is to generate tempo. That is to be quicker than your enemy can react to. So we were always ahead of the game in the case of the RUF. And it's a well-known military principle. I mean, they talk about maintain momentum and so on. But I think tempo is really vital. So quick decisions, in our case, the use of mission command, the mission command type orders, give people your intent, but don't try to tell them exactly how to do it. Trust them. All these things came out in Sierra Leone. In fact, one of the nicest things from my point of view is people like Colonel Gibson and Colonel the CEO of 4-2, come back to Andy Salmon and others say it was great to work in a genuine mission command environment because I was also doing a lot of political stuff with the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone. So I needed to give clear direction, make sure they understood my requirements, and then I let them get on with it. So that generates tempo. If they do that all the way down the chain of command, you can always outpace your enemy. It's not actually speed necessarily, it's a relative speed tempo, because you can be very quick, but if the enemy is just as quick or understands what it is that you're trying to do, then they can nip it in the bud, potentially. So it's all about relative speed. And then there's things like seizing the initiative and moral courage and things like that. I think that's important. But if there's one thing I'd identify, it's tempo.
I mean, for me, reading the stories and understanding what happened, I think it was a massive moral victory as well.
Yeah, I think one reason some people want to make this film and write books and things is that it would be a fillip for the armed forces. To be reminded that, on a good day, the British Armed Forces, because this really was a tri-service operation, is what we had called the Joint Rapid Reaction Force. And in the JFHQ, we had a very well-trained joint headquarters. But I had, as well as land forces, I had, the biggest fleet that had deployed since the Falklands War. And we had fast jets on HMS Illustrious. Helicopters, we had special forces. So it was a very neat package, around 5,000 to 6,000 maximum, mainly on ships. So those ashore, it was only probably at any one moment about 1,000 British troops on the ground. But it was a very neat little package that proved the JRF doctrine was right. Now, of course, if we could make that writ large, we wouldn't. Maybe you want to get onto it as we get to the end. Wouldn't have lost some of the respect that our potential opponents and indeed some of our allies now seem to think of us in. So, but at that time, post-Cold War, we were still quite gung-ho trying to do the right thing, and we created this JRF. I think we were as good as we were ever going to be, actually.
Moving on from Sierra Leone, East Timor, or Timor-Leste, as it's called now, isn't it? Why did we get involved in that? It's
Well,
the other side of the world.
Good question. Well, actually, East Timor, it took place in the middle of my trips to Sierra Leone. So I first went to Sierra Leone in '99, in January and February, and then in the late August, September '99, East Timor had got into the news. And the headquarters I told you about, the JFHQ, it was a wonderful job. I had a remit to go anywhere in the world to find out what was happening, to see if we, the British, could or should help. And then I'd make a recommendation. And if my thinking was that we should help, then I might well, normally the default setting was I would become the commander of whatever headquarters went in. Unless it got very big, I was a mere brigadier, in which case there were other options that more senior officers would take over my dead body. But anyway, that was a different thing. And so I went to Australia to find out what they were doing, because they had a particular relationship with the Indonesians, and the Indonesians were trying to prevent East Timor from getting their independence, and were trashing a lot of their towns and villages and being pretty brutal. And the UN asked the Australians to command a UN-mandated operation to intervene and to stop it from happening. Well, we weren't doing much at the time, and I went to Sydney, Canberra, and then back to Sydney before going up to Brisbane, where I met Major General Peter Cosgrove, who was going to command the operation. But to cut a long story short, I recommended to London that we could and should deploy a small force in solidarity, really, with the Australians, who had not done anything like this ever, where we were getting quite experienced in it. And when I went on my visits initial visits, they all said, "Could you join us? We really would like you there," for political solidarity reasons, but also for military reasons. They admitted they were lacking experience about what we call the theatre level of war, which was my speciality by then, the JFHQ. And so I went out I joined General Cosgrove, who's a very iconic character, and I didn't see eye to eye with him on everything subsequently, but I admire him hugely. A very strong leader. And they went in a few days after we got there. It was all very quick. I mean, the Americans said, "How the hell did you get there so quickly?" Which is testament to the point I made a minute ago about the JFHQ and the JRF. I mean, we were really well worked up by then. We were out and in on operations almost instantly in Sierra Leone, and also very quickly kept slightly slower than Sierra Leone because the Australians needed time to get the logistics sorted out, quite understandably. But we then went into Dili, found it was in quite a hell of a state. But actually, the Indonesia realized they weren't going to get away with this. And we took over Dili. The Gurkhas, I had 2 RGR with me, who were excellent, from Brunei. I had 1 frigate. I was actually a destroyer. Happened to be out in the Far East, so that was very lucky. Fortune favours the bold. And I had a couple of Hercules that allowed me to be independent of the Australians. So, it was a neat little operation. We stayed, I didn't stay, but the British stayed part of it until it became a UN operation at the end of the year. The CEO of the Gurkhas took on command after about a month. And I came back to England. Interestingly, via Egypt, was another exercise. I mean, it was a hell of a job. I didn't see much of my family, I can tell you.
I mean, for For East Timor, what was the hardest part of it for you? Was it the military side or the diplomatic side? Because
Well,
I do understand that there was a lot of diplomacy going on, not just with the country, but again, like you mentioned there with the Australians.
It's a great question. I found the military side often straightforward. You've got good people under you. They get your intent, and if they can, they'll deliver on it. If they can't, they tell you have to think again. All stuff we're well used to and trained in, and has been proven on operations. So the quality of people is central, in my judgment, to the success of operations, but sensible use of them and understanding what they can and cannot do. Something Montgomery is often criticised for was he was cautious. He was cautious, just as an aside, for a reason, which was that the British Army in the Western Desert, when he went out there, was not the army of 1930, the professional army of 1939. And so he didn't want to stretch them too much, and was therefore considered cautious. But he knew what the army was capable of and what the army wasn't capable of. And it's a really key quality of a military commander. Now, in my case, I was blessed, both in Sierra Leone and in East Timor, had outstanding people I could ask a lot of, and they delivered on my intent, as I said. And we then had a discussion if that wasn't possible. Much the tougher dimension of these deployed commands is often the diplomatic or senior military stuff. And the Australians, they seemed to think that they were going to fight another sort of small version of the Vietnam War. And I saw very early on from experience that actually the Indonesians were packing up. And they'd been lent on by the Americans too through economic means. We're told that, if they don't behave, then the Americans would be unpleasant to them economically, financially. So I went to talk to some Indonesians because I think it's really important to maintain a dialogue if you possibly can at the military diplomatic level as well as at the normal diplomatic level between capitals. And the Indonesian commander, who was actually quite a good bloke, who was obeying orders, he said, "We're off." And I said, "I can see you've got some ships in the harbour. They just steamed in." And he said, "Yeah, we're going." So I said, "So there's no need to put these anti-tank traps outside there." Of course, it was what the Australians were doing, things like that. And they hadn't picked up on it. And so that was the nub of the issue that you raised in your question. We had an uneasy couple of days when I was pulling in one direction, and I was only commanding as the National Contingent Commander of the British Force. I didn't have command of the operation proper. That was General Cosgrove. And he and his very good team under him were all going in the sort of, we're going to war with Indonesia direction, where I was saying, no, you don't need to do that. It's more humanitarian now. I mean, let's look after the Indonesians. So anyway, and the UN were very much with me, and the Australians didn't much like that. But very quickly, General Cosgrove came round to realising that on this occasion, anyway, I was right. And they turned the operation round. And I have to say, all credit to the Australians. The East Timor operation was a remarkable success, and they don't get enough credit for that. It's sort of lost in the noise. So I'm very grateful that you raised it, because General Cosgrove was an exceptional commander. He went on to be the Governor General of Australia, and indeed, using my very poor Australian accent, he was the Australian of the Year a few years later, and very deservedly so too.
Moving on from there, I'd like to ask you about Libya. For me, Libya was, I don't know, probably didn't have to happen. There was doubts about it, and it was seen as unhelpful. It was actually getting involved in there. You were in charge then of the armed forces. What was your thoughts on that? And do you think we were right in intervening there? And I suppose it almost went from trying to be a humanitarian thing to a regime change.
Well, you've summarised it, and that was the gist of my misgivings, shall we say, about it, and I argued that we didn't need to get involved. We did a successful NEO, non-combatant evacuation operation, some outstanding work by the Royal Air Force, actually, in getting people out. But, politicians, they love to see themselves as sort of modern-day versions of Churchill, winning wars, etc., etc. And they saw this as a moral issue, that President Gaddafi was a brutal dictator, made extremely provocative and unpleasant suggestions of what he was going to do to the people of Benghazi, etc., etc. We'd done the successful NEO, and then President Sarkozy in particular, but with Prime Minister Cameron, they decided that they would exploit that success, the NEO, to go on to what, as you rightly said, regime change. Initially, it wasn't regime change. This is the trouble. There was no clear objective. I actually argued against it, and did all the. Well, I probably wasn't very helpful to begin with, but I communed with my conscience. It wasn't illegal, although there were suggestions. It was because of the Russians actually were very helpful in that they feel, and it sows seeds of distrust, all these things, that they were duped at the United Nations Security Council when they abstained from a vote on it, in the belief that it was not going to turn into a military action. I'm trying to think who was American president at the time. Obama was president, because it's slightly thing on the military side first, and I'll explain why I raised Obama. David Cameron, prompted by Sarkozy, wanted it to be basically an Anglo-French operation, the glory of the old, colonial days, or what, I don't know. And so when I looked at what was involved, I said, there's no way this will be done with just Anglo-French. We don't have the necessary preponderance of firepower and people, etc., etc. And I said, more importantly still, is the command and control and the enablers, logistics, communications, intelligence. I said, this has to be a NATO operation, or at least the NATO has to be involved in some way. And that meant the Americans had to be involved. And I was initially leaned on to sort of not be so difficult. Why did I have to be involved? And initially the French didn't agree with me. But I persuaded my French counterpart that I was right, and he then agreed. He went to Sarkozy and said, the British General Richards is saying it has to be a NATO operation, really involving the Americans. And I think I've been convinced he's right. So we then convinced Cameron too. And then you'll remember Obama said, okay. And he used these immortal words in a way. He said, we are leading from the rear, which meant he was providing lots of enablers, but he wasn't going to get directly involved in the fighting. We were only directly involved in that we had some people on the ground, but there were Arabs who wanted, the Gulf nation, particularly Qatar and Abu Dhabi of the UAE, who wanted to take the opportunity to get rid of a man they didn't like very much. And he wasn't a good man, don't get me wrong, but there's ways of doing things and ways not to do things. And you're quite right, it's sort of morphed from a justifiable humanitarian neo-type operation into a regime change without really a clear evolution of government policy. It was taking advantage of the situation. And, as you would expect someone in my position, I said, well, what's the outcome? What do you want me to achieve at the end? Because I ended up, funny enough, coordinating all this stuff from the conference rooms in London. Because no one else, the British, we were the only ones. For some reason, the French let us do it, which is not like the French. So we sort of coordinated it. I was responsible for changing the direction of the main effort, for example, from along the coast to the south-north direction, which finished it quicker. But it was sort of dribbled into what it became, and of course, I never got a proper answer as to what the purpose was, what was the outcome, what was the political objective. They didn't even really tell me Gaddafi was a legitimate target. I actually argued once famously, but I said, unless he's in a military headquarters, I don't think he is a legitimate, legally under the laws of war, a legitimate target. I said, you've got to be very careful here because suddenly you'll become a legitimate target, Mr. Cameron, in 10 Downing Street, because someone you're fighting doesn't like what you're doing. There's all those sort of things were happening. Very political, literally in the end successful tactically, but strategically and in other ways, what a disaster. Libya is still divided. It's a very poor result. It should be very rich because it's got abundance of raw materials, and lots of people continue to die. So not a great success story, along with most of our operations, sadly, and his Western operations since the end of the Cold War. If you think about it, very few have been, strategically have been a great success. I mean, we've done tactically very well. British and American forces were never defeated tactically in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Libya was a success tactically, although we weren't hugely involved on the battlefield. And there are other ones, but it's the strategic level that we consistently fail at. And that was the reason I wrote another book with another bloke. He wrote most of it. I co-authored it last year, which looks at our run of failures and the way that our political leaders need to understand military tactics, but also military strategy and the linkages with grand strategy, where we want to be as a nation downstream. I'm afraid that's not very good at the moment. And in the era of sound bites and social media and 24-hour news, I think, to be fair on our political leaders, it gets harder and harder to focus on the longer term.
I mean, I've heard it said that we went into like Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places on the back of our success, let's say in Bosnia and Kosovo, and trying to ride the coattails on that, and we failed because not to plan what happens afterwards. Iraq being a prime example. We go in, we do the job. Oh, shit, then what? And it just all went wrong. I mean, we blame the Americans for that. Well, I do anyway. They didn't have, like you said, the exit strategy really, and how they just wanted to rebuild Iraq in their own image almost.
Yeah, well, you're right. Because Sierra Leone gets caught up in it's Bosnia, Kosovo, and then people tag on Sierra Leone as well. An example of Tony Blair's moral or ethical foreign policy, he called it. Well, I mean, looking at Bosnia to begin with was a disaster, the UN phase. Ultimately, it was a success. It became a success because we put enough troops in to dominate the problem, the issues. Kosovo, right from the outset, we showed resolve, and we also put a significant force in on the ground, and the Serbs got the message, and there was a pretty good understanding of the political objectives. If they had fought and it had gone wrong, then that would have been a different issue. But luckily for us, the Serbians read the tea leaves correctly, from our point of view anyway, and it was a success. Sierra Leone we've talked about. But thereafter, consistent failure after failure. At the strategic level, I emphasize that we as fighting soldiers, we've got nothing to be ashamed of at all. We did bloody well, actually, and I'm terribly proud of what the armed forces did. And indeed, all those that I had the privilege of having gone to command, for example, in Afghanistan, I was never let down by the military. I mean, if they failed, it was because their countries or we had asked too much of them. And none of them ever let me down as, I felt that I'm being let down by inadequate troops. Some are better trained than others, but you use those in ways you tailor their use. But I'm afraid it's all about ends, ways, and means. Politicians will have hugely ambitious ends, but we know that ways and means are what matters. So if you can say, like in Ukraine at the moment, we're encouraging the Ukrainians to go on fighting, even though they're in a hell of a state. I'm saying it'll be all right next year when we've done this and that. But in other words, up to now, the ways and means have been completely inadequate. So we're letting them down, and the same applies to what we were being asked to do in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and we talked about Libya. So ends, ways, and means have to be in sync, and it's no good our political leaders having very ambitious objectives, ends, if they don't have the ways and means to deliver, to allow us and many other agents and foreign officers so on, ways of delivering on that. And we have been consistently let down in that respect. And our bluff has been called. It's being called today in Ukraine. The European members of NATO are very weak because we've not spent enough money on our defence. I'm not. Well, we'll get on to talk about Ukraine perhaps at the end. I'm afraid that's the problem. Ends, ways, and means are out of sync. Lofty ambitions based on values are no good. Don't go to war unless your vital national interests are really at stake. And then, if you do, make sure you resource it.
I mean, we mentioned Afghanistan there. You were for a period of time, you were in charge of ISAF over there. And I believe it was the first time in quite a long time that a Brit had been in charge of American troops. Was that right?
Well, it was the first time since the Second World War I've been told, and I think I've done a little bit of research, that a British officer had commanded American troops at theatre level, i.e. at the operational level of command. Because quite rightly, as we should be, the Americans are very leery of putting thousands, tens of thousands of troops under a commander from another country at that critical theatre operational level. Remembering you have the tactical level, then you have the theatre operational level, then you have the strategic level. That operational level, the theatre level, is key because it's where you try to match those ends, ways, and means, and you have to shift things around to make sure that you achieve your objectives. And if you can't, you have to say to the strategic level, this isn't going to work. Or give me more troops, or give me more tanks, or whatever it is that you need to work the tactical level successfully. So, quite rightly, the theatre level is a very important level of war, and the Americans were rightly, they wanted to make sure that they felt I was up to it.
I mean, do you think that with Afghanistan, do you think it's changed modern warfare with the actions that took there, or was it just confined to that type of warfare in Afghanistan? The lessons learned there can be passed on to, say, somewhere like Ukraine or any other future conflict.
Well, I think, it was essentially a counter-insurgency campaign, whereas what's happening in Ukraine is state-on-state war, massive casualties and so on and so forth. So while I think myself that the principles of war, and something I use called the 10 Commandments of the Maneuverist approach, which talks about things like tempo, which we discussed earlier, do apply. The character of each of those types of conflict are different. My worry would be, should we ever get drawn into a counterinsurgency campaign of that scale, that all the lessons we learned won't be remembered, and our successors will find themselves having to learn them again through bitter experience. I don't know what mechanism today there is for capturing the lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq. There certainly was a mechanism, and the first thing any future commander should do in such an environment or such a situation is say, right, what did we learn from Afghanistan last time? I don't know if I was any better than others. I like, because I love history, so I'd like to think we did a bit of that. I put the ARC onto Afghanistan within days of taking command because they weren't going to even think about it. They were doing conventional war training for the next 9 months, and only about 4 months, 5 months ahead of our deployment were they going to start turning their attention to Afghanistan. Well, because of the import of your question, I realized, or I decided that was just not good enough. So we focused the whole headquarters for a year before we deployed onto Afghanistan and really got to understand it. I wrote my commander's intent and all those sorts of things, and got to know the people who were going to deploy under me. So I like to think we understood it, but then a lot of the political leaders who were giving me my political direction, and there were 32 nations, all of whom seemed to think they had a right to tell me what to do, even though I was a NATO commander, they were all different and they hadn't bothered to learn about such campaigns. So you're constantly trying to balance things out. There was a certain amount of don't ask, don't tell, just get on with it. Because if you ask the chain of command, it takes ages to get a positive answer. So I used to be a little bit cheeky in that respect. We came up with our own concepts based on Templars operations in Malaya, the Afghan Development Zone concept, which is more psychological than military. But I'm not that sanguine, to be frank, that, if we get involved in that sort of war, it won't be the same mistakes as were made, and we also made, I've no doubt, won't be repeated, because that is historically a fact. Although good commanders will do their best to learn the lessons.
If we could go back to Afghanistan, if we could go back, I don't think we really want it, but if we did, if we were to go back now, what should we do different to what we've done before?
Well, we first of all have to understand your enemy, i.e. the Taliban. We didn't properly understand the environment. And I say we, I mean, essentially, I have to say it was essentially an American operation. Even though I was a NATO commander, they underpinned it all. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld, who you hear a lot of criticism about, his instinct was not to get drawn into the counterinsurgency aspects of it, but to go in, get rid of Osama bin Laden, deal with the Taliban, and get out. Now, you couldn't actually do that because they'd have been back very quickly. So you had to have a training campaign on the Afghans, but for a critical period, that wasn't the main effort. While we had that period about 2002 to 5, 6, when I got there in 6, it was just beginning to get a bit tougher. The Taliban had realised that we weren't as big or as united as they had thought. They were starting to dribble back and becoming quite effective by 2006 in certain places like Helmand. But we employed tactics that were appropriate for a much bigger force. So we should not do that again at the tactical level. You have to reflect the reality of the situation, which is why we came up with the Afghan Development Zone concept, which you protect what you know you can protect. Like, for those of you who are in Helmand, you might make Lashkar into a protected entity. You might spread it out a bit for as much as you can protect. You use good troops, special forces, your infantry battle groups to attack the Taliban location where you need to. But essentially, you create an environment within the Afghan Development Zone, which people outside it say, actually, we like what you're doing there. My cousin who lives in Lashkar is doing really well, and no bombs are getting in, or very rarely. It's not an issue for people. He's making money. Their children being well educated. We don't like what you're offering, Taliban. Now, it's not as neat as that, but that sort of war is often about psychology. and we should have based our tactics much more on that sort of thing, and not tried to pacify every square foot of Helmand, for example. And you remember those futile platoon houses that led to loss of life and didn't achieve anything tactically or politically. So that would be one thing I'd do. I would have focused much earlier on training the Afghan National Army and then handing it over to them with things like the ADZ central to it. But, counterinsurgency operations are very, very difficult and very complex, as we now all know. So I think the wisest course of action, if ever we find ourselves in that situation again, is not to do it. That's the big lesson. Use local forces, etc., to do it. But we are now we see what's happening in places like Sudan. That is a taint on us all, that those people are starving and being murdered and raped, and we're doing nothing about it. And it's partly the legacy of Afghanistan and Iraq, the Western nations who have the capacity to help, at least in some ways, just don't want to get involved. So that's the real legacy, I'm afraid, of Afghanistan.
Yeah, that makes me think. So when I'm at work and talking to the kids at work, I don't think people realise how much conflict is actually going on around the world. You mentioned Sudan then. I bet most of the people who even listen to this don't realise what's going on there. And it's all around Africa. There's things happening. And the West does seem a bit scared to get involved. And you're right there, morally, I think we should. We stood by and watched Rwanda happen, and nobody really, intervened. And I think in places like that, we should, that's just my thoughts on that. But I think it should get involved in places like that.
I think you're right. It is, a shame on us. But I'm afraid the counter argument is that, and here this is about interest versus values, our vital national interests are not at stake in any of the 7 wars going on in Africa at the moment. Sudan being the most topical and the worst, but there are 7 conflicts going on. And there are others in South America and so on. You've seen that President Trump's having a go at Venezuela, etc., etc. The problem is, do you go to war for values or only when your vital national interests are at stake? The trouble again, that you can do both, but you've got to resource them properly, because we don't want, as sympathetic as we might be, we don't want to see body bags coming back as a result of us having insufficient combat power in places like Sudan. Now, in Sierra Leone, which was a rather typical African war, one way or another, we created the impression with our enemy that we had much greater strength than we actually had. And we talked about Lungilol and making a psychological point to the RUF. So there are ways of doing it creatively, but at the end of the day, you need to have sufficient combat power. And somewhere like Sudan, maybe with Western troops helping the right side, maybe you can do that without being the biggest, numerically the biggest part of that force. But you're still going to get involved. There are still going to be risks involved in even doing that. So you've basically got to have competent and quite big armed forces, and you've got to have political leaders that are prepared to take the risk of casualties for whatever reason. And those things just don't seem to be around at the moment. If you look at our own armed forces, as we sadly know, the army is only about 72,000. Unbelievably small. As a gunner, I risk sounding too gunner on this, but we've hardly got any.
No. It's crazy.
Very poor political decision making over many years.
I've heard it said it was on another podcast. That's the Unconventional Soldier podcast. The way they spoke about it on there was, we should be planning for the future, but at the moment we should be bolstering the RAF and the Navy because we're not going to get attacked by a land force anytime soon. And if we are under threat from Russia, which we obviously are, either militarily or espionage or whatever you want to call it, we should be looking at building up the RAF, the Navy, so that it can defend easily or easier the British Isles, and then build up the army after that. And if they were going to if they were going to roll over and come and have a go at us, it'd be 15, 20 years before they're capable of doing that at the moment because of Ukraine. And they've lost so much equipment and manpower. And nobody actually knows how much equipment and manpower they've lost because they don't tell anyone. And the same with the Ukrainians. They may be falsifying their figures or hiding them. I don't know. But you're right. The army, I mean, like you said there, artillery, it beggars belief. When I joined, it was one of the biggest regiments in the army. And in the Second World War it was, and for long after that as well. And people, we all have a bit of banter about different regiments and stuff like that, but I don't think people realise how important artillery is, especially like field, like you said, tube, AS-90, light gun, even the old F-870. I miss that gun. I don't know why.
Yeah, that was a great gun because it was a 155mm, same as the AS-90. Yeah, when I took over third, we still had F-870, and some outstanding soldiers who could do amazing things with it, even though it was a bloody big gun. I'm trying to remember his name, but one number one could bring that F-870 into action by himself.
Gary Bennett.
Yeah. Was it Sergeant Bennett?
Yes, Sergeant Bennett, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Well, someone will tell us. There was a little gap with him at the start. He's a lovely man. I should really... I don't know if it was. I think it probably was. J. Batcher, I think. Would that be? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I remember Malcolm Rifkin on his first visit to us on Salisbury Plain. We happened to be on the plane, so he came to us. And I got him to do his one man and a gun trick. And he brought it into action and fired I think he was trying to do it in under a minute. It's something amazing. So even F-87, but the key, as you and I know, it's not about the gun, it's about the shell. That's the weapon. So you need a 155mm round. The light gun's a great little gun, but it's got shortish range and not a very big thing at the end of it. The 105 round. But what you said about these more military strategic level. Yeah, first of all, I don't personally believe the Russians have any interest in invading Europe. I mean, what world are we living in? Of course, that's the propaganda. But why would they do that? Get involved in Germany and Poland, and think of the insurgency that would go on. I mean, they'd have to be totally balmy, and actually, they never have said that's anything like that they intend to do. So I think while you've always got to build up our defensive and make sure there's a proper deterrent down the NATO whatever border, I keep calling it the new version of the inner German border when we were based in the the Cold War in Germany. And we've got to have a good deterrent force based on capable and well-equipped armed forces. I think that's absolutely a requirement. I personally think, particularly if you do that, there's no way Russia will, and you hinted at this, will invade us. They will use hybrid means to make our lives uncomfortable. Stop complaining about it. Do the same to them, is my retort. It's what we did in the Cold War. We had a good understanding relationship with the Russians. We lost the opportunity post-Cold War to bring the Russians into the body of the Kirk. They warned us that what we were doing, doesn't matter what we think, by the way, this is what the Russians think, without excusing their actions for one moment. Because I'm very sympathetic to the situation Ukraine finds itself in. But they said, please don't spread NATO to our southern flank, 500 kilometers from Moscow. They had visions because we weren't being very cooperative with us putting tactical nuclear systems in Ukraine. There was nothing we were saying was going to stop them thinking that. And don't forget, the Americans have something called the Monroe Doctrine, which is okay for the Americans. And by the way, I'm quite happy with it. But you can't be hypocritical. Under the Monroe Doctrine, no other nation must get involved in America. If they do, the Americans will act militarily to remove that threat. And that's, of course, what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But when Russia says the same about Ukraine, or some other great power speaks about its immediate, the area around it, then that's no good. So there's a lot of hypocrisy and misunderstanding about it. The key is that we should not take any risk, carry a big stick and talk softly, and slowly, once this line can be drawn under the war in Ukraine, slowly re-establish a relationship with Russia, probably after President Putin has died, and let the Americans and us focus on the bigger issue with perhaps Russia in due course, because they're not natural allies, and that is China. I mean, it's balmy at the moment. Somehow, stupidly, we've driven China and Russia together when we should have grand strategically been trying to separate them. And now even India we've driven into that sort of camp. That is not great grand strategy or foreign policy at work. And I think those in charge of this in Europe in particular, because President Trump's trying to do something about it at least, those in Europe, in power in Europe, really need to start thinking again and grow up.
I mean, that leads me on to one little question there. The separation of NATO. America doesn't want to get involved in Europe, let's say. Is that... I don't think that's doable, especially at the moment. I don't think the European countries could... How would I put this without sounding like silly? Could look after themselves without America.
No, I think you're dead on, Frankie, that we've got ourselves in this position. I find it rather pathetic that we sort of strut our stuff and got nothing to offer. We say to Ukraine, you can't do this and that, you can't negotiate, which is what happened in 22, when they got very close to doing a deal with Russia. And people like Boris Johnson, but many others, said, no, you're on the move here. You can take back Crimea even. And people like me said, you're totally underestimating Russia's capabilities and resolve. I was sort of slagged off a bit as a peacemonger. But I was looking at the physics of war and the psychology of war in a way experienced military commanders should, and that, of course, politicians never do. They just think in moral value terms. So we lost that opportunity in April 22 when Zelensky withdrew from the talks in Istanbul. We then encouraged them to go on fighting, saying we'd give them all sorts of stuff. We did a bit, but never enough. They are now in a very poor situation tactically on the issue of casualties. Yes, we have estimates of Russian casualties, and they're pretty horrendous. We don't get estimates of Ukrainian casualties because they are very, very careful about what the amounts they're losing. But I can tell you through independent sources, there's something like between 90 to 100,000 amputees now in Ukraine. Very, very sad. No nation can sustain that level of casualties, and many more than that have obviously been died or have been killed or are injured. The population of Ukraine has dropped by about a third since the war started. So we are asking them to go on fighting our war on our behalf without committing our own troops. And there's a sense to that, in that we should never get into direct combat with Russians because of the risks of escalation. So I buy that. But really, to go on asking Ukraine to fight on our behalf without giving them the means to win, I think is strategically stupid and morally indefensible. because it just isn't right that we should ask them to do that without giving them the means to win. And quite clearly, given Russia views it as an existential issue, you'd have to do much, much more to even begin to change the dynamics on the battlefield. So I'm afraid I feel pretty ashamed about the West's approach to Ukraine. I was all for helping them win, but through, if someone had defined what victory was, which no one did, they were very vague about it right from the beginning in the West, but not to give them the means to do it was then irreprehensible. And we now find ourselves in that position. And by the way, if they don't do a deal, it will only get worse, in my judgment. The Russians will seize the whole of the Donbass. And as you said a minute ago, they're then, I don't think they're on a march further eastwards, but they will have achieved their war aims. They could come back in the years to come. I think if we get it right, they shouldn't. We've then got to build up Ukraine to make sure that doesn't happen. And most importantly, we've got to make NATO into the feared deterrent force that is necessary to make sure the Russians, even though I don't think they would try to attack us directly, to make sure they don't. And we have to be robust with them on that. But with luck, from that becomes a more constructive relationship with Russia downstream.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned China earlier, and we were talking about Africa just now, but China seems to be taking over Africa everywhere, and not militarily. It's just, yeah, we'll build your bridge. Oh yeah, you need new motorways, we'll do that. Here's a few hospitals, and they're doing it economically. And I think it's quite interesting that that's happening in Africa, where in the 60s, 50s, 60s, we were fighting a proxy war against Russia, Angola, places like that. And we've kind of just like left the Chinese to take over, more or less. We've lost interest.
Well, that's really astute point. The reason is that unlike us, the Chinese are strategically minded people. Sun Tzu, Chinaman. I mustn't keep quoting Sun Tzu. Their leaders start to be trained and think strategically in the Sun Tzu fashion from an early age. Ours come into politics having been making money in the city or teaching or unions, and suddenly we're asking them to run our nation. And foreign policy. And so what hope have these people got? They've never probably thought about it most of the time. And so you get the foreign policy wonks who determine what they should say and do, who are the same people who've repeatedly been part of us getting into wars we can't win and so on. The Chinese have a grand strategy. It's called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. And it is about creating a sort of empire, but certainly a hugely influential group of nations right through the southern, now known colloquially as the global south, but particularly in Africa, through economic means and through not questioning the politics of the countries in question, saying we're not really worried about that, work within certain limits if you could, please, but we're not worried about that. We will help you achieve your economic and strategic goals. We're not questioning, if you like, the ethics of the way you function. We have chosen not to be like that, and the Chinese, unsurprisingly, are making, well, they're more than making inroads, as you said, Frankie. I mean, they are now the key influence in most or much of Africa, and now you've got the Indians going to be doing similar stuff, using the same wise, non-military ways of doing it. And as Churchill said, he said the trouble is we need a little more Georgia and a little less war. And all we get, is either you don't get involved or it's all about quite military, aggressive approach to things. And countries don't like that, which is why the BRICS, the 5 BRIC nations, and the global south are actually not siding with the West, the Europeans and the Americans, over Ukraine, because they think we contributed to the situation, even if none of them would say it was our fault in the way Russia actually invaded Ukraine. I think they don't like that at all. But basically, they don't want to get involved. And the Gulf Arabs, very similar. They want to retain their own independence and look after their own vital national interests. Sometimes that will involve being nice to the Chinese or even doing deals with the Russians, and sometimes it'll be doing deals with us. But don't think we're going to cut off relations with the Russians and the Chinese, for example, simply because you've asked us to do so. So you could argue, if you like, the era in which America was the dominant nation, the unipolar war, academics, unipolar situation, the academics call it, is now dying. You hinted at this, President Trump. He's sort of okay with that. He really wants to focus on making America great again and looking after Americans. And he doesn't like war either. And he's quite right on that. I think, where else one can criticize any political leader for, on that one, Trump's instincts are 100%. And we should be helping him living in a realistic world as opposed to a make-believe world such as we're trying to create for the poor people of Ukraine at the moment.
I mean, could you ever see our boots on the ground in Ukraine? Because I know it's been hinted at.
Well, I think it would be very dangerous without Russia's consent, and Russia will not consent to it. And if you put them in, you've got to do it with your eyes wide open, other than in that situation. If you put them in, eyes wide open, they will be tested. The Russians will make life difficult, and you've got to be prepared to respond. And the only response you can have is you get out, you failed, or you go to war and fight back. And then there's no point Britain deciding is going to do that. The whole of NATO would have to do it, and most importantly, the Americans have to do it. And it's quite clear, as you said earlier, that the Americans do not intend to get into that situation. So I've thought this as, gesture strategy, really, this business of we're put in a coalition of the willing, or whatever they've called it. But it's dangerous, doable in theory, but in practice, I think almost impossible to do in a way that a responsible prime minister or president, whoever's offering to do it, would accept.
Right. Well, we're coming up to the end of the podcast now because I know you've got to get away.
Yeah.
Couple of last little questions for you though. So after a lifetime of command, if you had somebody coming up to you now saying, "I want to join the army as a young officer," what advice would you give them?
Well, funny enough, I'm a one-man recruiting band because I've got three great young men. One is in the process now of successfully joining the Navy. Another one wants to join the Navy. I'm very joined, and the other one, I think, would like to join the Army. And I'm very enthusiastic about them doing so because, as I've said to you on this podcast, at the tactical level, the level we operate routinely, it's vital that we have the very best people. And I think still we do attract the very best people, whether officers, young officers, or soldiers. I mean, if you're in a sinker state in, I don't know, anywhere in Britain, and you've got the moral courage to leave your chums to go and join the army, that means you've got something just for doing that. So I used to be full of admiration for, my Geordie soldiers whose brothers were in prison, but they decided to join the army and often became very good soldiers and ended up in the sergeant's mess with diggy bows on and mess kit and all that stuff. So I think the army is a great meritocracy. I think it's ill-resourced, badly under-resourced at the moment. But over the next 5 years, I'm taking the government at face value that they intend to improve that. I have to say, I'm sceptical because I don't see the money is actually in the budget yet. But let's give them fair wind for now. the army's too small. It needs to get bigger so that when these young men we're talking about go on operations, they've got a good chance of success, at least at the tactical level, like we were lucky to have. So I remain enthusiastic. I certainly am not of a view that that they shouldn't join the armed forces, albeit that if things went on in the way they were, I fear, going, then that question would have to be asked. Would you want your son or daughter to join the army? I think it's still a very good career with some very good people, and obviously often operation is hugely satisfying, even if it's just a neo from somewhere, or I don't know. Royal Engineers used to build great things in Africa. We could get back to that, but be ready for the big events, war, at the same time in the way we used to. Then it will be great. And I know the Chief of the General Staff and all these people. That's their intention. So I'm all for giving that aspiration fair wind. And in the meanwhile, we need good people.
Right, last question then. Put this one. Throughout your whole career in the armed forces, what decision or what act has affected you the most, and the public don't realise how difficult that can be, even at the high levels? What decision or incident affected you the most personally?
Well, that's a great question, because as you get older and more senior and have a bigger range of responsibilities, quite a few things. I mean, one little one was when I had to tell David Cameron that if he didn't give me the authority to secure the provide security at the Olympic Games, then the armed forces wouldn't be able to do it. And other people in government were really anti giving it to the armed forces because they said they could do it. So that was a difficult one. Luckily for me, David Cameron, with whom I had a good relationship, really, he said, yeah, it's going to the armed forces, and we just did it. And that was an immaculate operation by the armed forces. I think, to answer your question specifically, there are many times when my moral courage was challenged. Speaking truth under power. Maybe I overdid it as a result sometimes. But I think fighting for more troops in Afghanistan when I was CDS was vital and difficult. Many times we talked about Libya. I think that the single decision that was had most import for me as a person was and we talked about it quite a lot today, was the decision to do what I did in Sierra Leone. I didn't actually hesitate because I was convinced I was right. And people say it must have been a hell of a gamble. I say it wasn't a gamble. There were risks, obviously. And I was very lucky. I got away with it. We didn't lose a single soldier on Palliser. But I think when I look back on it, that was probably the toughest decision. Although, funnily enough, I didn't pause on it for too long. And it was the one that was definitely the most rewarding. In fact, I'm going back to Sierra Leone in May next year. They've invited me back. I'm still something of a bit of a ledge there, so I'm going back there to see them and to talk about what we did. But yeah, I think that would be the answer. But something, it's quite difficult to answer that question because as you get more senior, maybe people further down the ladder don't really understand it. Why should they, and why would they worry about it? People at the top, particularly as Chief of Defence Staff, you are. It's a very political role. Without becoming a politician, you've got to understand the political level, and you're under a lot of pressure from some very influential, powerful people, and you just sometimes have to say no, and that's quite tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, saying no to a Prime Minister could be quite difficult. Thanks again for coming on. I know you need to get away. I'd like to wish you a Merry Christmas because it's December now. And I hope you have a lovely time, and wish you all the best for the new year. But again, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts on the podcast. It's been a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you for asking me, Frankie, and thank you on your good wishes for Christmas, and to you and to everyone who's listening, and to our old regiment in particular. I went to a couple of events in the autumn, and met veterans who I've known, and I realised how lucky we are, not just in 3rd RHA, but in the other regiments I've been in, and indeed across the army and the armed forces. We're a very lucky group, and we need to stick together, and your podcast is a big part of doing that. So thank you very much indeed.
I hope you enjoyed that podcast. I enjoyed recording it. If you could just hit the like button, and also if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell, that would be great, because it'll help the channel grow. The more people will see it, the bigger it'll get, and the more guests I can get on, and the more people I can talk to. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, like I said. Look forward to the next one. Hopefully we'll be out next week as normal. Bye-bye now.